The birth of the Resident Evil series in 1996 sparked a survival horror craze within the games industry and influenced titles like Dead Space and Outlast, among others. While Resident Evil may be Capcom's most well-known horror offering, it wasn't the company's first attempt at the genre. In fact, Capcom was already experimenting with horror all the way back on the Famicom in 1989, the game Sweet Home. Not only was Sweet Home Capcom's earliest horror game, it also served as one of the main inspirations for Resident Evil itself. In fact, when Capcom began development on Resident Evil in 1993, it was initially intended as a Sweet Home remake, before being forced to change direction due to licensing issues. Although Resident Evil turned into an original work rather than the remake or sequel, it still featured numerous inspirations that can easily be traced back to Sweet Home, even down to the setting. Both games take place in large, intricately designed mansion settings. Given how little Sweet Home is talked about compared to games within the Resident Evil series, we felt like it'd be a good idea to pry open the game's heavy iron door and step into its iconic 8-bit mansion.
TapTap.
Before we can talk about the video game Sweet Home, we have to talk about the movie that preceded it. Sweet Home was based on the Japanese horror film of the same name directed by legendary Japanese horror director Kiyoshi Kurosawa. In the movie, a TV production team visits the residence of deceased painter Ichiro Mamiya to document his last works. Ichiro's old mansion seems uninhabitable, but inside lurks the vengeful spirit of Lady Mamiya, the late painter's wife. Lady Mamiya's life was filled with tragedy. She was badly burned when her son accidentally fell into the mansion's furnace and died. Disfigured and traumatized from her child's death, she lost her grip on reality. In an attempt to give her deceased son friends to play with, Lady Mamiya went on to kidnap children from a nearby village to toss them into the furnace, before ultimately throwing herself into that same furnace. In the film's present day, Taguchi, the production team's photographer, accidentally knocks over a monument near the mansion while taking pictures. This sets Lady Mamiya's angry spirit free, which leads to all kinds of horror and bloodshed. With middling reviews, the movie Sweet Home can't exactly be called a classic, but its unique cinematography and realistic special effects succeeded in creating a memorable horror experience. To further capitalize on the film's release in 1989, a video game adaptation of Sweet Home was to be released the same year. While it wasn't an exact recreation of the film, the game is based around the same story. In the late 80s and early 90s, game adaptations of films and TV shows primarily fell into one of two categories. There were action games, which typically focused on gameplay mechanics over story, and there were adventure games, which more strongly tied their narrative elements back to the original source material. Most Japanese game adaptations of the era belong to the latter category. A good example of this is the video game adaptation of Akira released by TUSI in 1988. Sweet Home was originally planned as an adventure game along these same lines, but the film's director, Kiyoshi Kurosawa, wanted something different. With that in mind, game director Takuro Fujiwara came up with a new idea, one that would recreate the terror of the movie on a more psychological level. To accomplish this, Sweet Home started with the foundation of a Japanese-style RPG. The movie's mansion would be translated to digital form, essentially acting as a large RPG maze. The RPG look was combined with adventure game style exploration and puzzle solving, along with inventory management and survival elements. The story would be told through cinematic cutscenes, and collectible clues such as notes and diary entries could be found to expand on the backstory. But these elements alone weren't enough to capture the feeling of horror that the team at Capcom was looking for. To build that sense of psychological dread, they came up with the killer concepts for Sweet Home's structure. Sweet Home features 5 playable characters, just like the 5 characters that make up the TV crew in the movie. Each character has a unique key item that they carry, so each one is equally important for progressing through the game. Akiko, the producer, has a medical kit that can cure poisons and curses. The director, Kazuha, have a lighter that can burn ropes blocking the player's path. The photographer, Ryo, uses his camera to reveal hidden information in paintings. Reporter and art restorer Asuka has a vacuum cleaner that can remove dust from paintings and broken glass from the floor. And finally, Kazuha's daughter, Emi, carries a lockpick that can help unlock certain doors. These unique item skills wouldn't be all that significant if you could swap between any of the characters at any moment, But Sweet Home restricts players from exploring with a team of 3 characters at most at any one time. The remaining 2 are forced to split up and head off on their own. If players are familiar with the game's map, it's easy to end up with 2 completely separated teams. That leads to scenarios where players have less combat power and where they run into puzzles that cannot be solved without a party member who's off in the other group. Everyone knows the old horror movie trope where splitting up inevitably leads to disaster. Sweet Home makes players live that nightmare. Of course, the party members get access to some useful items outside of what they start with. Within the mansion, players can find helpful items like medicine bottles, wooden boards, and candles. These items aren't unlimited, however, and each player can only carry 2 items at a time. Those wooden boards may make for great bridges, but they also break after a few uses. If that happens when a party member's crossing, they'll end up hanging precariously over a pit and someone will need to hang back to rescue them, splitting the team up even more. Sweet Home's mansion maze is deviously designed to present players with moments where they can have the whole crew together, followed by suddenly needing to split up and navigate in smaller groups. This alternating sense of tension and relaxation is a key component of Sweet Home's signature style of horror. Sweet Home also set itself apart from other games with the way it handled death. Unlike typical RPGs, Sweet Home offers no way to revive fallen party members. Once a companion's HP reaches 0, they die. Permanently. To really drive this home, character deaths are showcased via a cutscene where they're shown bleeding out on the ground. What's unique about death in Sweet Home, though, is that even though it's permanent, one companion's death doesn't mean game over. Players can continue the game with the characters that remain. What about unique items? When a character dies, players can find a substitute for their item. For example, a broom can be replaced with a vacuum cleaner. However, these replacement items clutter up the limited inventory space and force players to make tough decisions about what they can carry. The game becomes more challenging as a result, and preserving the lives of all remaining party members becomes all the more important, and all the more difficult. If a player really wanted to avoid a character's death, they could always reset and return to the previous save, but Sweet Home had a limited number of opportunities to save the game. Maybe a reload would temporarily save a companion's life, but they would still be severely injured and in danger of dying all over again. Despite the assortment of tricky situations players could find themselves in, Sweet Home isn't an especially difficult game. Exploration and puzzle solving were the real challenges, while combat was streamlined and much simpler than other RPGs of the time. Players just had to smartly use the call for help command to swap between team members and carefully take advantage of enemy weaknesses, like using candles or lighters to burn off maggots. Sweet Home's video game story is similar to the movie, but with some key differences. Various monsters and spirits that weren't in the film roam the mansion solely for gameplay purposes. Fujiwara also created multiple endings. Sweet Home has 4 possible conclusions, depending on how many characters are alive when you reach the end. If only one person survives, they'll build new memorial monuments for their deceased companions and Lady Mamiya, praying that such tragedies will never happen again. If 2 or 3 people survive, the screen will show the living characters going through their lives with the spirits of the deceased companions floating nearby. If 4 people survive, they'll look on as the mansion collapses and lament that it would have been better if everyone had survived. Interestingly, the ending where everyone survives is widely considered the most unsettling. In this ending, the 5 survivors are speaking to a character who seems to be their boss. This character is turned away as the crew informs him that the report is complete and asks for his feedback. Then he turns towards them, revealing that half of his face is just a skull. For players familiar with Resident Evil, you might recognize this scene. A seemingly friendly character is seen from behind, but something seems off until he turns, revealing a horrific visage. That's right, the first encounter with the zombie in Resident Evil is actually a reenactment of this ending from Sweet Home. In the mid-90s, when consoles like the PlayStation and Sega Saturn were being released, Sweet Home director Takuro Fujiwara spent a lot of time thinking back on Sweet Home. Despite receiving some favorable reviews, Sweet Home was never released out of Japan, and he felt like the game had been held back by the limitations of the Famicom, especially in terms of graphics. Fujiwara went to the higher-ups at Capcom and pitched the idea of a remake. It turned out that a remake of Sweet Home was not possible, as Capcom no longer had the license for the film it was based on. Fortunately, this fostered the creation of something new, something arguably better, Resident Evil. Fujiwara enlisted the help of his protege Shinji Mikami to help bring the new project to life. Mikami had previously worked on Aladdin for the SNES, which sold over 1.8 million copies after its launch in 1993, and it went on to become Capcom's best-selling SNES game outside of the various versions of Street Fighter II. In other words, Mikami was a promising talent at the company. In a recent video, Mikami visited Silent Hill creator Kichiro Toyama's newly created Bokeh Studio. During this trip, Mikami recalled one of his first meetings with Fujiwara, where they spoke about Sweet Home and what would become Resident Evil. I remember Fujiwara calling for me for a meeting, Mikami shared. He told me about how Sweet Home's system was good, but that the game didn't perform well. He wanted to try again to push the game's system onto a horror game. I truly enjoyed Sweet Home, so I completely agreed with him. I was honored I could work on that. Among the aspects of Sweet Home that Mikami praised and wanted to retain were its system of unique items assigned to each of its characters, and the general idea of having to survive with limited resources. The point was how to survive in an environment with limitations, Mikami explained, describing Sweet Home. In the end, that's probably the main thing I took. The player has to make a series of choices with limited resources in order to survive. I kept that, then I made something completely different. Although Resident Evil shifted Sweet Home's Japanese horror to the more American zombie subgenre, you could still see traces of its roots throughout. Both Resident Evil and Sweet Home feature a large, explorable mansion. Both games have limited inventory spaces that force players to juggle items and choose what to take with them. And both even featured a creepy first-person view when opening a door. These foundations have been carried forward with various iterations and can still be seen in modern Resident Evil titles like 2021's Resident Evil Village. Even Resident Evil 4 Remake still has the classic inventory Tetris that some players love. Looking back, it's impressive to see how far Resident Evil has come. But it's also fascinating to think about how its tried and true formula can be traced all the way back to the 1980s with a humble concept born from a Japanese horror film and a game adaptation that never even made its way west.